Hello everyone and welcome. We have spoken a lot about different sorts of armors like scale armor, logica segmentata, lamella and so on. Now, you might have noticed that a lot of these armors have disappeared or been less popular, and a big reason for that is mail. It is finally time we start actually talking about mail. Now, some of you will probably know mail armor as chainmail. Now, chainmail is a word that was invented in the late 18th century because mail in the form of letters that you send were becoming more and more popular. So there was more and more confusion in between the mail armor and the letter you sent in the post to whoever you wanted to send them to. The mail armor changed name to chainmail, or at least certain people started using chainmail instead of mail, just to avoid any confusion. Now in this video I'm going to be talking about mail, but in case you are wondering, I'm going to be talking about the armor, not the letter. Now, mail was invented around the 3rd century BC. Kind of debatable, we don't exactly have very clear sources, so it's kind of hard to pinpoint exactly when it was invented. But we do at least have some sources from that period of time. But we know it was probably invented by the Gauls or Celts, and from there the Roman Republic very quickly adopted it. The Roman Empire kept it, and it even became more popular during the Roman Empire. And then after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, it had become the primary armor of basically everyone in Western Europe. Now, clearly you did probably have some other armors like scale armor, for example, but mail had replaced all other metal armors to a very large degree. Of course, you still had some other armors like padded armors, gambesons, that was still in use, but that's not really a metal armor. And it stayed the primary armor of everyone in Western Europe until like the 13th century, when people around that time actually started experimenting with different plate armors, so coat of plate, brigandine, and later plate armor. But even after those plate armors had been invented, so whether that's brigandine or plate armor, mail was still a very important armor. It was very often worn under brigandine. It was very often worn on its own by poorer soldiers, and it was also used a lot in the gaps of plate armor, and even on early plate armors it was worn underneath the other parts of the armor, so the breastplate for example. And on later plate armors it would be placed in the gaps of the armor and different places. And we even still use mail to a certain degree today for example, diving suits to protect against shark bites, for chainsaw gear to protect yourself from the chainsaw and that kind of stuff. So it's still used today to a certain degree. So what exactly is mail? Now, mail is basically, well, an envelope, and in that envelope you'll put a certain... No, wait. No, I got the wrong one. This is not what we're talking about. We're talking about the armor. Mail armor is a certain armor made up of different rings interlocking together to form up a certain mesh that is going to make up an armor. Now, except in the case of buttered mail, but that is not really a historical sort of mail, it's more of a modern sort of mail that we make today because it's easier to make. But in the case of historical mail, the rings are going to be riveted together, meaning that you are going to have a ring, the two ends of the ring are going to overlap, and you're going to drill a hole and put a rivet through that overlapping section, so you can actually shut the ring, and it will be way harder to break open. This is not the case on buttered mail, but again, buttered mail is not really historical, it's just a modern sort of mail. In buttered mail, the ends of the ring will just be touching each other, they will not be connected with a rivet, which obviously makes it way weaker. Now, that is the base principle of how mail armor is constructed, but you have different exact variations depending on period, region, and use. For example, some mail armors will only have half of the rings riveted. The other half is going to be basically an entire ring that is going to be punched out of a plate. meaning that there is no riveted section for that ring. It's just an entire full ring. Now this is commonly done because you don't need all the rings to be riveted, because if you have one riveted ring, it can go through all of the non-riveted rings, and you'll still be able to make the armor. And obviously it's way easier to not have to rivet every single ring, so it's just better to have that full ring just to make the armor easier to make. But obviously not every ring can be a full ring, because else you wouldn't be able to attach them together. So usually you will have one row with riveted rings, one row with entire rings, one row with riveted, and so on, so you can actually attach everything together. Now the size of the ring can also vary a lot between different mail armors. So for example, if we take this armor right here, it is made up of 6mm rings. This armor that I'm wearing right now is made of 8mm rings, and if we take something like the mail on this helmet here, it is made up of 10mm rings. So you can really have all sorts of differences in the size between different rings. You can even have more difference than 6 to 10. Some mail armors will have rings down to 5mm. Maybe some of them will even have down to 4mm rings, but that's going to be very rare. And some could even go up to something like 11mm, or potentially even 12. Now, generally speaking, the smaller the ring, the more the armor will protect, because it's harder to pierce, but the heavier it will be and the harder it will be to make. Because if you have, for example, an armor made with 5mm rings and an armor made with 10mm rings, you actually need 4 of those 5mm rings to cover the same surface as one 10mm ring. So effectively, you need 4 times the amount of ring. So you need 4 times the amount of rivets to attach all the mail together on a mail shirt with 5mm rings. So clearly it's way harder to make, and therefore not always worth it, even though it might protect you better. The thickness of the wire used in the rivet can also change, and also some rings will be flattened and some will be round like that in the wire used to make up the rivet. Then you also have different ways to connect all of the rings together. Usually what would be most common would be a 4-in-1 pattern. So that means that every single ring will be attached to 4 different ones. This is the case of this mail shot, it's the case of the mail on this helmet, and on the other mail too. It is really the most common, but you can have different ways of doing it. For example, 6-in-1, so every single rivet, every single ring is attached on 6 other rings. That's going to form a kind of heavier mail that is harder to pierce, but obviously way more heavy too, because you have way more rings and it's harder to make. So that's usually going to be used in weak points in the gap, generally speaking around the neck, because you want to protect that more, and you need that heavier, denser mail to protect that place more. Now you can also have other variations between different mails. For example, some mail shirts will have 2 rivets instead of 1. You obviously have buttered mail that has no rivets, and so on. So you have some slight variations, but these are the main changes you can have to mail armor. And you can also make mail armor for basically every part of the body. Mail armor can protect every single part of the body. You can have mail coifs for the head, you can have mail gauntlets, you can have mail chaussures, which are basically mail pants in a certain kind of way. You can really have all sorts of different armors made of mail to protect your entire body. Now, mail was usually worn over some sort of padded garment. So whether that is a gambeson, thick clothing, anything like that, just to add some padding underneath armor, because mail is not good at protecting against blunt force, because it is so flexible that it will basically not absorb any force. All the force will just go right through. So blunt force can be a problem. Therefore, you usually want to wear it over some sort of padding, so that can actually absorb part of that blunt force. Now, it wasn't always worn over some sort of padding. For example, if we take the Gauls, there is no evidence whatsoever that they had any form of padding under the mail whatsoever. They had like normal clothing, but no evidence of anything further than that. But we do have a lot of evidence that they used mail, and to a relatively large degree. So there's no evidence that they used any form of padding underneath. For the early Romans that used mail, so during the Roman Republic, there is no evidence that there was any form of padding underneath the mail. The first real traces we have of any form of padding worn underneath mail is from the 1st century BCE approximately. So theoretically, in terms of what we know, everyone that wore mail before that didn't wear any form of padding underneath, in terms of what we know. Now, obviously, it's still way better to wear some form of padding underneath the mail. It will add a lot of protection, but mail can also work on its own relatively well. It will just be bad against blunt force. It will still work perfectly fine against cuts, preventing the cuts from actually cutting into the flesh or anything like that. It will still work. So now that we know what mail is, we can start talk about why it became so popular and why it mostly replaced the other armors. Now, the primary reason why it became so popular was because of durability, because mail is incredibly durable. It has no backing to attach things to, it has no straps, nothing like that, so there isn't really too much that can go wrong on a mail shot. And even if like a link breaks, whether that's because it's just bad quality for some reason or because it actually gets pierced by something, the whole arm will not fall apart. You can actually still perfectly well use a mail shot even though it has lost a couple of links. There's no problem with that. It is also incredibly resistant to rust because yes, like rubbing off the rust with like sandpaper or something like that is not possible on mail. It is just too rough and you will basically end up destroying your sandpaper instead of sanding away the rust from the links. However, if you really are in a state where the mail is incredibly rusty and you need to get a large amount of rust away, you can put it into a barrel filled with sand and just roll the barrel around, and that will basically add as sandpaper, just scrubbing away the rust. But you are very unlikely to get to that state of rust with mail. And the reason for that is that when you are wearing it, when you are holding it, whatever, every single link will actually rub against the other ones and will actually scrub away the rust from each other. So it is very unlikely to have ever the time to rust a lot because you are moving in it and all of these links are rubbing the rust away. It is essentially self-cleaning in the sense that just by wearing it, you are going to rub that rust away very easily. Now, obviously, it can still rust, especially if you are not using it for a long time, it might rust. Or certain particular sections of mail can rust pretty easily. For example, if we take this one piece of mail here, now this is the shoulder guard of a Lorica Hamata, and as you will see, it has these leather edgings, it has leather on the back, and so on. Now, the problem with leather is that it will absorb a certain amount of humidity that will actually stay in the leather and has a chance of making the mail rust. And you can actually see pretty clearly that this section here, the shoulder guard right here, is actually a little bit browner than the rest of the mail. And the simple reason for that is that it is a little bit rusty. And also, if you look on the inside of the edging, the part that has been surrounded by that edging is actually pretty rusty because the edging has contained all that humidity. Now, I just want to add that this armor is not used a lot. If it was used more, it would probably be able to shake off a certain amount of that rust, and it wouldn't be too much of a problem. But generally speaking, if you have these leather edgings or anything like that around mail, that's going to contain a certain amount of humidity and is actually more likely to get it to rust. Then there's also something that I've noticed, which is on this helmet. The front of the mail here tends to rust a little bit. And that is, of course, because I have my head inside the helmet and I am breathing all the time into the mail. And clearly my breath is a little bit humid. So it tends to get the mail to rust a little bit because it is still humid when I am taking it off and not using it anymore. So it kind of has time to rust a little bit. Now, that's not too much of a problem. It will basically remove the rust the next time you wear it. So it's not too much of a problem, but you know, mail can still rust a little bit. Now, when a mail wasn't used for a long period of time, typically during the Roman Republic and Empire, where you had different soldiers and you didn't necessarily have enough soldiers compared to the amount of armors you had at a given time. So obviously you could imagine that these armors would start rusting because, well, they are not in use and they are not being shaken off the rust all the time. Now, the good thing about mail is that there is a very simple way you can store it, and that is simply by putting it into a barrel of oil. And what that will do is just prevent any rust from forming because you are constantly surrounded by oil. Now, obviously you could do this with other sorts of armors, but the problem is that other sorts of armors will usually have certain kind of organic material on them, whether that's straps, backing, laces, anything like that, that will kind of get degraded by a continuous exposure to oil. And also the good thing about mail is that you can just pack it into a relatively tight bundle that will shape up to any form you're putting it inside. If you take something like a solid breastplate, you cannot put it into the barrel if the barrel isn't wide enough for the size of the breastplate. So fitting a lot of breastplates inside a barrel is much harder than fitting mail inside a barrel. So in the end, mail is very rust resistant, and that can really be useful. And in actual fact, a lot of mail shirts would actually last for centuries once they were made, and would be inherited from father to son over the course of several generations because it was so durable that it could actually survive long enough. Now, aside from durability, mail also has the big advantage that it has no gaps, meaning that where this arm is supposed to protect, there is no gap. My side is protected, armpit is protected, everything is protected where the arm is supposed to protect. If we take something like a lamella, even a scale armor, a lorica segmentata, or anything like that, they will have different gaps. So whether that, usually that's going to be the armpits, that's kind of hard to not have a gap in, but it can really be anything. And obviously certain armors also have a problem that certain blows angled in different ways can actually pierce the armor. For example, if you take scale armor, a blow coming from underneath can actually come underneath the scales and actually pierce the armor. Mail doesn't have that problem at all. No matter where the thrust comes from, it will not be able to easily pierce mail without actually piercing through it through a link. So now let's talk about the disadvantages of mail. Now, the main problem mail has, I would say, is that it's much slower than an email. Wait, what? No, we're not talking about mail, we're talking about mail. What? Anyways, I understand myself. So anyways, what are the disadvantages of mail armor? Because clearly it does have some disadvantages. It cannot be perfect in all situations. Now, obviously, mail is really good at protecting against all sorts of slashes and cuts. However, well, it's not the best at protecting against piercing damage. It can still protect against most piercing blows, only it's not the best. Like a heavy warbow, especially if using Bodkin arrows, will probably be able to pierce mail, and some later medieval melee weapons like warhammers, rondel daggers, some things like that could probably be able to pierce mail pretty easily. But in terms of earlier weapons, in terms of swords like Viking swords, Gladius, in terms of spears, or that, most probably they will not be able to pierce mail, and mail will be able to protect you relatively well against those attacks. Especially if we're talking about some good quality mail, because usually if you're seeing tests on YouTube, for example, where they are actually testing to test how protective mail is, the problem is that, well, sometimes they will use buttered mail that is way worse at protecting against everything, so it's not really the same armor at all. And generally speaking, even if they use riveted mail, they will actually not necessarily use the best quality riveted mail. That's the first problem. Now, obviously, you did still have some bad quality mails in history, but good quality mail is better. And in any case, I have never ever seen anyone trying with small rings. The smallest I've probably ever seen is 8mm rings, but you do have mail with 6 or even 5mm rings that is going to be way more protective. And obviously you have things like 6-in-1 mail armor that will be way harder to pierce too. So generally speaking, against piercing damage, Heavy warbows will probably be able to pierce mail, but in terms of other things, they are unlikely to, at least earlier in earlier periods of time. Late Middle Ages, yes, things could probably pierce mail. But the main problem is that it is bad at protecting against blunt force, because it is so flexible that it will not protect against any sort of blunt force, and the blunt force will just go right through it because it's so flexible. So you're basically only relying on your gambeson underneath. Obviously, the mail will remove some amount of blunt force, but that's going to be very little. And that's probably the primary problem of the mail armor. It's not very good against blunt force. However, it is very important to remember that your armor is not your primary line of defense. Your primary line of defense is actually going to be your shield. And you're actually going to use your shield to defend yourself, and you don't want your armor to absorb the blows. That the armor is kind of a last chance thing, just in case you get hit. Even though you had a shield, you're actually still protected. And that means that most, and I'm talking the vast majority of blows that are actually able to hit the armor, are not going to be strikes with a lot of force. Meaning that, first of all, even though you might have a weapon that has a chance of piercing mail armor, it is unlikely to do it because you're not going to be able to hit with full force someone while he's trying to defend himself. And even though the shield might not have been enough and you're still getting hit on the armor, there is a very large chance that part of that force is actually going to be absorbed by the shield, because the shield kind of stood in the way and your opponent kind of had to get away around the shield to hit you, or you came up with your shield just a bit too late, so it's actually getting pushed down and you're still getting hit. But the shield is likely to absorb some of that force and you're unlikely to get hit with full force. Especially because you also have the problem that your opponent is unlikely to be able to deliver a blow with full force, simply because it's actually dangerous to deliver a blow with full force, because you're exposing yourself to your opponent's attack. So yes, mail might not be great at protecting against piercing damage, might not be great at protecting against blunt force, but you are unlikely to get hit with full force, so you're not likely to get hit with a lot of blunt force or having something that is actually able to pierce the armor. And then you have arrows, because arrows will get shot with full force, so when you actually get hit, you're going to get hit with full force. But again, the shield is your primary line of defense against an arrow, and you're supposed to stop the arrow with your shield. Now obviously it can still get past the shield, you might not be able to block every single attack. Someone might shoot from the side, from behind, or from multiple angles, so you can't defend yourself enough to stop all the arrows. So that is probably the primary weakness of the mail, that it can be pierced by arrows. But again, you have the shield to protect you, you have formations specifically designed to protect against arrows, so you're still unlikely to get hit by an arrow. Then you do also have some minor problems with mail. For example, here it tends to get caught in the rivets of the rings quite easily. Can be a bit annoying, but it's kind of a minor inconvenience. It's not really a big problem. And finally, you also have the problem that it takes a lot of time to make. An average mail shirt will have around 30,000 rings, meaning that you have in between like 15,000 and 30,000 rings to rivet, depending on whether you're riveting all the rings or only riveting half of them. But in any case, you have a lot of rings to make and a lot of rivets to rivet together. So it takes a lot of time to make. You're probably looking into the 2 months of work, of basically constant working for a single mail shirt. And that is excluding going to get the material for the metal and stuff like that, of course. So that was a big problem. Now in the end, mail armor was basically good enough at protecting you against all sorts of attacks, because your primary line of defense is a shield, and the mail only comes in as a secondary line of defense, meaning that the vast majority of blows that actually hit it will hit with a little force, so mail is enough. And other than that, it is a better option than some other armors, because it is so durable that, well, first of all, it will never fail you at an unexpected point, because there is no strap that you need to hold it together. At worst, you'll lose a link, but as I said, that's not a major problem. You can perfectly well use your mail shirt, even though it has lost a link. And yes, it takes a lot of time to make, but it is worth spending 2 months of work to actually get an armor that will last for centuries and that will get inherited by your children and their children and so on, because it's such a durable armor that that's actually possible, and it wouldn't be with other armors. And obviously during like the late Middle Ages, it still kept being in use, mainly because it is the only